Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Montero, and this is the Strongtown Chicago podcast, where we talk to the activists, leaders, and educators working to make Chicago just a little bit better for the people living in it. Today, my guest is the Alderman of the 44th Ward, who started in his position in 2023. Since then, has driven a number of things forward, including re-legalizing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, across the city of Chicago for the first time since 1957. And who has shaped the direction of the Lakeview neighborhood up in the north side. So without further ado, Alderman Lawson, Bennett Lawson, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex. Happy to be here.
So quick question before we get into the specifics of ADUs. You're a freshman in City Council.
Yes.
You've been on the job for just about 3 years at this point. What made you decide to run for alderman in the first place, and how did you approach the job once you came into it?
Sure. So I've been in public service my whole career. I started working for the state Senate immediately after graduating from Loyola, where I was very involved with political campaigns, Jan Schakowsky most notably, and then moved to city service when I was 26 years old. So I was a little kid who wanted to be president of the United States, right? I saw elective office as a path, but wanted to make sure I did it in a really intentional way, in a community that I had strong roots, that I'd been very involved, and had been able to shape policy up until the point I had run. I was Tom Tunney's chief of staff for almost 15 years, did a little bit of everything in that office, had seen the neighborhood grow during that time period and wanted to refocus that for the next 20 years or more as to what we wanted our neighborhood to look like. There's a lot of managing growth in Lakeview, but we have to promote it as well, and not just in Lakeview, but citywide. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe Lakeview to folks who maybe haven't been in that neighborhood as much or live in other parts of the city? What makes Lakeview distinct versus other neighborhoods in other parts of Chicago and other parts of the north side?
Sure. So Lakeview is Irving to Diversey, Ashland to the lake, very roughly. My ward is a little bit less than that, but does include the Southport Corridor, Wrigley Field, the Vic and the Metro, of course, North Halsted Entertainment Area, Boys Town, Lakeview East, the Broadway Strip, Belmont Harbor, all those areas. And I will always say that our biggest strength is our density. A dense neighborhood, helps promote walkability, helps support our small businesses, and helps maintain the transit that we have. So all those things combined have been the biggest strength for Lakeview, in addition to having, Major League Baseball team that brings a lot of tourists in. We have 2 first-class hospitals that bring a lot of jobs and obviously take care of the healthcare of a large part of the north side. So there's a lot that was happening here already. And I think we saw interest in the community, for many years from different groups and continue to.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you came in as alderman, I believe you introduced 3 pieces of legislation when you first started out. Can you walk through what those 3 were and why you decided to pursue those things first?
Sure. I did 3 value statements, basically. I lowered the speed limit on the street on Wellington in front of Illinois Masonic Hospital to 20 miles an hour. We've been working on additional traffic calming there as well, but really about talking about safe streets, talking about driver behavior, talking about safer pedestrian access, visibility, bike access as well. That's important for our dense community. We have more and more people that are not relying on a car, certainly more people that don't want to have to as well. And we have to make sure that we have that kind of community that fosters that. The second was a very technical but meaningful, if we pass it, we didn't pass it yet, tweak to our zoning code in regard to personal services. Salons, barbershops, waxing, estheticians, tanning, nails, where they have a distance requirement between each other of 1,000 feet if they're located in most of the zoning districts we have throughout the city for business districts or commercial districts. That can add a ton of time and money for a new business, especially businesses that are largely run by first-time business owners, women, immigrants, people of color, and can be crushing if you get into this and not realize that you have all this extra work to do just on zoning because you're within 500 feet of a barber shop and you're a beauty salon. So that we're still working on. I hope to get to that. But to cut some tape for small businesses is important to me, to get them open. They're the lifeblood of every community. And then lastly was the ADU ordinance. I didn't think I would be the one to run it in the end, to be honest. I thought it would be more collaborative or something. But as things worked out, that ended up being the one that got the most press, certainly, and was the most impactful.
Mm-hmm. And why were ADUs important to you specifically? As I mentioned a little bit earlier, ADUs had been banned in Chicago since 1957. There was a pilot program that began 2020 to allow them in some limited zones in some parts of the city. What made ADUs an attractive issue to you, where you said it's probably time to expand this across Chicago, even though this hasn't been a thing for almost 70 years?
Sure. Well, there were really two things. I worked on the pilot. I was chief of staff for the zoning committee when it took effect, and was very involved even prior to that with the legislation, with the passage there. So it was important for me to look at the data from the pilot and see it through. I also represent a community that is not a stranger to multifamily development. We have ADUs. I live 2 doors down from 2 coach houses, actually, and that I had worked in the neighborhood capacity, legalizing a lot of basement and attic apartments that had been converted, and the permit was lost, or there was, they bought a 3 flat. It's city only says it's 2. How can we do this without parking? So seeing the constraints of some of the built environment, but also to see how these multifamily dwellings work in a neighborhood like mine. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about a couple units here and there, that's a lot easier to absorb. I call it gentle density. It's not my term, but I like to use it. And after talking to my colleagues, especially, I mean, housing was not an issue in city races, at least, or at least not at the level it is until 2023, I felt like. And ADUs came up a lot. It's something I felt I had some knowledge to help with. I was a true believer from the pilot and the work that we did there. So knew that it would be a challenge to get major legislation done, of course, but wanted to do my best and work with my colleagues and talk to a number of them about how they saw it working in their communities. Even in lower density areas, multi-generational living is sometimes more common. And this supports that. It supports, stability for a homeowner, and investment in underserved neighborhoods too. We need housing in every corner of the city. That's become very, very obvious, and this is one of those tools to help us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the term ADU gets used a lot and has been used in a lot of cities that have legalized it. Here in Chicago, it includes not just the backyard cottage or granny flat or coach house, as we call it here. It also includes spaces within the main building. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the ordinance does and doesn't include?
Sure. So it's the two. So you have an accessory unit, which is within an existing space. Mm-hmm. And then the coach house, which is generally new. It could be built over an existing garage, but usually new in the rear. And they're different things, right? Some of it is, the first is using existing space for housing. And that's
often an attic, a basement.
An attic, a basement, a back storage room for a business, an upstairs office. I have a chiropractor who's interested in changing his office, which he doesn't need anymore, on the second floor to housing. Mm-hmm. And that helps stabilize his income on the building, pay his taxes. And then we've also made sure that you can do this on the first floor with commercial spaces that may be too big. So if you have a very large commercial space, if you keep the front commercial, the street facing, and do residential in the back, now you have a unit at grade. Mm-hmm. So it could be roll-in accessible, and it's on an alley, so it tended to be a little more affordable too. So making sure we're looking at all of those options, right? Most expensive is the coach house, right? Because you're building a brand new structure. You have to run plumbing and gas, back to the garage, which typically didn't, and you don't have any parking in some cases. And so that was, parking was the issue that a lot of people raised as a concern. I have a dense neighborhood where free parking isn't expected or shouldn't be. But that's not the case in other parts of the city. And so understanding sort of how they work in my community, understanding how they could work in other communities, and there were supporters far northwest, far southwest, far south, that really wanted to see this come to light, not just northwest and on the north side where we see a lot of activity, but really citywide. And so we crafted an ordinance pretty carefully and went through a few different permutations to get to 50, and that's what we did.
You mentioned that housing wasn't as prominent of an issue in aldermanic races until the most recent cycle in 2023. Why do you think that is, and why do you think there's been a shift from a whole bunch of restrictions on how much the city can grow and how much housing there is there that tried to put downward pressure on how many people were in the city, going back to the 50s and continuing since then? Right. Why do you think there's beginning to be a shift to some people saying we need to make it easier to add additional housing? Is there a particular reason that's resonating with people now where maybe it didn't a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago?
Right. I think it's hard to, point out, we started with TOD 10 years ago, a little bit more under Mayor Emanuel.
Transit-oriented development.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And I think that was new at the time. Although when you look at a neighborhood like mine, that's exactly how it's built, right? I have a lot of density on the lakefront where I have really great bus service. I have density around our train stations because it was actually zoned for it in my neighborhood. Other wards were zoned far lower than what they were built. And some of that was protectionist, that you couldn't come in and tear everything down and start new. Some of it was anti-gentrification in some ways, and that's still something we talk about. But, the conversation was sort of a slow burn. I think COVID exacerbated our problems as far as rental. What I was renting 6 years ago has doubled in Lakeview, right? And so the need becomes all the more pressing once you start to see the volume go up, or the price go up, I should say. We also are beginning to see the supply side problem where both for rent and for sale properties are just not on the market like they were. Part of that's interest rates, part of that's the cost that keeps going up. It's great to see it appreciate, but if you can't stay in your neighborhood, or replace it in your neighborhood, you're not, it's not going to work. So the focus on supply is different than the focus on preservation or on affordability. And it's important to talk about that because, what we did with ADUs is not a subsidized program. We're building affordability because we're building units that are smaller, they're in basements and attics, and adding to supply. And adding to supply in every neighborhood, not just those that are easily financed sometimes, right? So it was important that we looked at all those factors, I think, going in. But, again, as far as the timeline goes, I think it was a slow drumbeat, right? And that was exacerbated by the pandemic and everything that happened after. And now we're in a spot where we should have started 10 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of coach houses that were preserved in our neighborhood, especially because you couldn't build them. Some of them were 4 bedrooms. They're huge.
Right. Grandfathered in.
Yes. And so unless it was in really bad shape, there was usually an interest in preserving it because you couldn't replace it. Not all, but some. Now, what we've allowed with coach houses is smaller, per se. There's no bedroom limit like there was, but there's still a height limit. And the rear yard, the garage sort of square footage footprint. But it's still better than where we were not allowing them. You had a lot of people who would try and add like a bathroom to a coach house and they couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. So then they tear it down. Then they'd go, they go further in the rear yard, or they didn't have as many options. So it's all about giving people options. And I think we're at a point with our housing crisis in our city, which we do want to repopulate, that we have to build it.
Now, the final version of the citywide ADU ordinance that came out did a number of things. It legalized ADUs across different business zones, right, and commercial zones. It legalized them in multifamily by right residential zones, but in single-family zoned areas within wards, essentially those areas had to opt in by ordinance. And that's significant considering that 2/3 of Chicago's residential area, more or less, is owned single-family only. Even, as you pointed out, in neighborhoods where there are plenty of apartment buildings, 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats, 6 flats, if those burned down tomorrow, you couldn't rebuild them as anything other than a single-family home. So my question is, given that there was an understanding that there's upward pressure on rents, we need to do something to build housing supply so that people can live and can stay in neighborhoods where they want to stay. Why was the final version of the ordinance that was able to pass, why did it have that opt-in provision and allow some wards essentially to not opt in their single-family zones?
Sure. So in going through the different versions of the ordinance throughout the year and a half that we ran it, it became clear that you were going to have real problems in some areas of the city with accepting it, whether or not it was allowed, whether or not it would be taken advantage of. I think what I think we came to was a compromise that allowed us to take in the majority of the city through the people that have single family areas opting in all or part of their wards, addressing some of the concerns about, investors are going to come and buy everything and then it becomes a 2-flat the next day. I don't know that you and I think that's the worst thing in the world, but that changes the neighborhood drastically. And nobody is looking to do that with this type of ordinance. And that's really one of the tenets of it, is that you're not changing the scope or character drastically of a neighborhood. It's pretty minor. So it's new for some people. Not everyone was in the pilot. So not everyone has seen how this works. People think there's no building permit required. You 100% need a building permit for this.
Right.
There's no short-term rental, no Airbnb, no VRBO. These are apartments for Chicagoans. which actually helps in some lower density areas. But, we know that this is new for some folks that have not had multifamily in their neighborhoods, but we can test this. We can pilot it in areas that are near them. They can see those impacts. And I have 3 colleagues right now talking about adding areas. So we're not done in adding those areas that are predominantly single family. And then they can also see them in their business and commercial zones. And I think they will start to, because we just don't have the same kind of commercial square footage demand as we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, probably. Yeah.
As of today, the ordinance went into effect at the beginning of this month on April 1st. As of today, how many wards have opted in their single-family areas into the ordinance, and roughly how much of the city is covered by this ADU ordinance?
Sure. So it's 34 wards that have opted in, all or part, and there's a few wards that, like the 42nd ward, doesn't have any R zone.
Right.
So we can say that they're in because they're already multifamily. We also left the downtown zones out. The D districts, they're all multifamily districts already. It's a different formula when you talk about adding 1 unit, which usually doesn't happen downtown. They're adding 10.
Right.
And so that's a different process. So, I think, right. So 34 wards, which is 2/3 of the council, are in on some level. But then all those business and commercial areas are too. So we're reaching probably closer to 3/4 of the parcels in the city. When you look at, the total number of units that we could add here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you foresee this growing into a full citywide legalization at some point? What would that look like? And what do you think would have to change versus what was true last fall when this ordinance was being negotiated for that to be adopted as policy in Chicago?
Well, let's see what the state does.
Okay.
I think that's going to drive a lot of things.
IDUs are a provision legalizing them by right as part of the build package that the governor's put forward.
Yes. And I've met with the governor's team on it. We've talked about what we had to deal with in the city, pro and con, and what worked for us. With the coalition we put together was really, really important. And so I think that has changed the conversation. To go from citywide to statewide is huge. People need to get used to it a little bit. And when we look at the neighborhoods that are most resistant, they may stay that way. But there are others that are going to see this as an opportunity. And the more people who get to see the coach house work and get to see the nice folks who live there and want more neighbors in their community, I think they come around to it. This may become an issue in campaigns going forward as well. We're not going to solve it this term in the state or the city. So I think housing pressures, affordability is going to be a top concern for everyone. Certainly as we look at municipal elections next year. I'm not sure if it's going to change the fate of one of my colleagues at all, but it might. It might, depending on where they are.
And what do you see now that this has passed and now that there's starting to be some enthusiastic about it? How much momentum does it have? What have you seen in terms of the early numbers of how many people are interested in this, pulling permits for this, say they want to build an ADU, converting in their building or adding a coach house to their lot? What's the interest that's popped up so far? Sure.
So in the first week that the system was live, and it's chicago.gov/ADU, there's a one-page form that's basically clickable. You put in your address, you put in your type of housing, the number of units that are there. It will tell you if you can build one or not, the type of unit you want to do too. So we saw 130 applications in the first week, which was equal to the number of applications in the last year of the pilot.
Wow.
So now first week is probably a busy week. We know that not everyone who files an application builds a unit, but to see that demand and to see it was not just in neighborhoods like mine, but from Howard to 131st, from Harlem to like Avenue Q, somewhere on the southeast side. There's still a concentration where development is heavier, but you see this in almost every neighborhood, and that's really going to help us as these come online to socialize it with other neighborhoods that aren't involved.
Yeah, you see more stories where this becomes a real thing that someone did, not an abstract policy.
Right, and the interesting thing about the first week is that the coach house number was higher. It was closer to 40% of applications, where it was about a quarter in the pilot as a whole.
I wanted to ask about coach houses specifically because I believe in the final version of the ordinance that passed, there are some labor requirements for coach houses that are different from the requirements for conversion units in buildings, attics, basements. Can you talk a little bit about what those are and what that means, both for someone, a homeowner who wants to build a coach house, and for people in the trades who may want to help build a coach house and offer their services to actually creating one?
Sure. So this was part of the deal we struck with labor and with those people who had concerns that the counterproposal was apprenticeship aligned contractors for every new ADU, and the compromise was we're not you're refitting some spaces that are existing. Some of them just need an inspection. A coach house is generally ground up. Let's do the apprenticeship requirement there because there's more building systems, there's more to learn. It's a higher dollar investment too, and then keep the other that could be more general. So it's new for the city. Actually, it's something that we had not done before on this level for something that doesn't have public money. Projects that have public money have different labor piece requirements or prevailing wage. So right now on the form you fill out online, you check a box that says I will use apprentice-involved contractors. That's not the right term, but it's on the website through the project. Our task then is to make sure we're finding those contractors who are involved with apprenticeship programs, some who are unionized, some are not, and putting them together with the people who want to build coach houses. We're working to stand up a resource with the Department of Housing, some of our partners in labor and apprenticeship programs to help reduce that barrier. Walsh and Pepper aren't building coach houses, but HACIA, the Hispanic Contractors Association, has been very involved and supportive. Smaller scale contractors that do have apprentice involved programs that would build something of this scale, this is an opportunity for them and for young people to learn, which is a good thing for our economy and our growth and for them to buy a coach house of their own someday, right? So it's something that we're working through some of the details on. Right now, it is the owner who's applying that agrees to follow that rule. But we want to make sure that it's easy to find these contractors who are interested and that we're standing up those contractors who are involved in apprenticeship, because that is important.
Mm-hmm. And for a contractor that currently doesn't have an apprenticeship program, what would allow them to qualify for this? Can they just hire an apprentice and say, I have an apprenticeship programmer now? Do they have to get a stamp from somebody? What does that look like?
It's a virtual stamp, I believe. So there are apprenticeship programs that you qualify for,
right?
That you can engage in with the United States Department of Labor regulates them. So any one of those approved programs, there's varying levels. I think it's different depending on the trade as well. But then you don't have to have an apprentice on site. You just have to be involved in the apprenticeship program.
Right.
One would think that this would be a good spot for an apprentice as opposed to, an I-beam situation, but they're everywhere and they're working on every, type of project. So there is a little bit more than just, checking a box on your own, but some of them are lower threshold, lower dollar. But again, depending on the size of your operation, the trade that you're in, it makes it, there can be some differences.
And you mentioned that there's an effort right now to get together people interested in building these things and the people who can build it for them.
Right.
Where can people find some of those resources? And where can people who want to become qualified builders, who meet the requirement, find out how they can do that?
TBD.
Sure.
So that is the piece that we're working on now. And like I said, we're working with the Department of Housing to stand up a resource, Department of Law to make sure the disclaimer is right. And then our partners in the trades and in labor. Hire 360 has been a great resource. I talked to their executive director yesterday about how we can stand up programs, including a lot of those smaller contractors that they work with. It'll be a website, right? And it's going to be voluntary. A contractor wants to come in, they can. And, obviously, an owner can use whoever they want, from that list or whoever qualifies. So we're standing that resource up now. It's taking a little time to get. Actually, there's a lot of work on the back end to get everything up for ADU applications and processing, both from housing and buildings and zoning. So that took us a while, and now we're on to the apprentice piece.
Yep.
Yeah.
And for the piece that is live for homeowners who are interested in this, what does that portal look like? What can they do in it? And how should they approach it?
Sure. So again, chicago.gov/ADU. It's a one-page fillable form with your name, your address, the number of units on the property, whether you own or rent, condo or rental building, the type of unit you want to build. So I filled it out for my building. Don't tell my neighbors, right? We didn't pass the condo board with that. So I said 4-unit building, right? We want to build a coach house, just one. And then it asked about the affordable requirement, because we did not change that in the ordinance. You still have to build every other ADU affordable. So 1 is market, the second one's affordable, 3rd is market, 4th affordable, et cetera. Whether or not you have that requirement and what you need to do to meet that and agree to that, If you're building a coach house, that you agree to use apprentice-involved contractors. And that's about it, I think. Like, again, it's a form that most of us would know all that information off the top of our head, right? And so I encourage people to look at it and see if there's options there. It'll tell you right off, specifically in some of those single-family areas. But it's very, very easy, and it gets the process running, and you're qualified before you invest in permits or drawings or certainly looking at contractors.
Right. That form essentially tells you whether, yes, you are allowed to do this or no currently.
Right.
And then the next step would be reach out to an architect, see about pulling permits, make a plan for how to actually build this thing.
Well, and back to our conversation about single family areas, there are some additional restrictions that may apply depending on your address. So in some cases, there's an administrative adjustment requirement. In some cases, you have to be the property owner-occupied property owner, which you have to prove up with your tax exemption, your property tax exemption, and others that would want administrative adjustment, just so people know.
Block limits?
Block limits. Those are the three. I repeated one. Block limits. So depending on the zone you're in, if you're in R3 zone, it's 3 per block per year. 3 per block per year would be great. I think I have one block that has 3 throughout the entire course of the pilot. And it's a really busy block for building anyway. So we'll see how those limits come into play, but it does prompt those for you too, based on your address.
Now that this is in play, hopefully we start getting some ADUs in areas that weren't covered by the pilot, but are covered under this expansion now. What are some of the things that you're hoping to see or to learn over the next year that can inform how this program evolves going forward?
Sure. I think we're watching the numbers and we're watching the locations to see, where we maybe need to do more promotion to property owners, where we can partner more with my colleagues on things. We want to make sure this is citywide. And one of the provisions that we haven't talked about much is actually standing up a fund based on the fees paid by ADU contractors or applicants that would assist homeowners in underserved communities to do the same. So being able to bring that program to fruition means that we have a lot of ADUs that are happening, and we can start to stand these up in areas that don't get the same amount of investment.
So some form of city grant, city financing.
Right. Forgivable loan of a certain amount. And that still has to be worked out in those details too. Can't really do that till we get the fee in though. So we have some time. But that was very important to my colleague Pat Dowell, for example, who saw this as an opportunity that people would need a little help to take advantage of in some ways. I think too, the more colleagues that come in is important. We're going to get an annual report to the city council that is word specific, is citywide, is going to talk about the types of units, from application to completion. I think that's going to help inform sort of our next steps on that too. Those first few in neighborhoods, I think, are really important to celebrate. And I hope that I know the neighbors will, hopefully, and my colleagues will, but that the communities do when they come online, because it's the start of a trend that can be very, very positive. And if we can continue to build that, not just in our city, right, but other places too, I think that will help with everything we're facing right now.
For the wards that haven't opted in yet, what would you tell your colleagues there, those aldermen, to make them consider opting their ward into the ADU ordinance?
So the ones who have not opted in are almost exclusively bungalow belt. Like there's very few 2 flats, if any, maybe some corner apartment buildings. I tell them that, that bungalow used to have 8 people in it, and now it has 4 and a dog.
Household size has gotten smaller.
Right. It had 4 kids, 2 parents, grandma and grandpa, and 3 dogs or whatever. So as household size has gotten smaller, and I think we're at record lows as far as household size, right? That impacts a lot of things in a community, right? The walkability, your transit, your schools, your small businesses, certainly. So, I think to look at how this is working in other bungalow areas, right? Look at how this is giving options for people who are even in low density areas. It's not exacerbating a parking problem, a free parking problem, or drastically changing the fabric of a neighborhood. I think, that's what people I mentioned are concerned about, that everything becomes a 2 flat right away, or a lot of outside investment displaces the community that's been there for 100 years. And, I think that those would be cautionary tales if we do start to see that. I don't know that we will, but we got to watch all of that and find out. You have to listen to the market too. That's something sometimes my colleagues with Grace don't always do that, right? We think we can legislate without talking to the people who are actually putting the money in and doing this. And so we need to be really reacting to where the market is going in addition with our policy, because very often we think we're going to lead the market or we're going to do this and everything will continue to get the same amount of units. And it's not always the case. And we've seen a lot of that in Chicago, and we should probably examine all of it, frankly. Part of that is giving people more options. I talk about the ARO, or Affordable Requirements Ordinance. We're getting less affordable units than we did at a higher percentage. There's got to be a sweeter spot there. Or we've talked about a mix of units. For a long time, it was all studios and ones that people were building. Now we want larger units. So we'll take less than 20 if you're doing larger units. We have to figure out some formulas there to actually hit our goals and make it financeable. I've lost out on a few projects where they've decided not to do planned development. They've decided to do 5-story, and they're building by right. And so we don't get affordability, we don't have the union labor, and we don't have the kind of density that some of these projects could handle if they could finance it. So we need to be really mindful of that in all that we do, but especially with ADUs, which are very low threshold when it comes to the financing piece, but maybe the most important thing I've ever financed other than the house I'm living in for most of us, right? And so to stay aware of that is really, really important.
Now that ADUs are part of Chicago's vocabulary, legalized again, what are some of those other frontiers you see as tools that can be used to tackle the housing affordability crisis and making it easier for people to live and stay in their neighborhoods?
Sure. So continuing to build on our TOD, transit-oriented development, ETOD, equitable transit-oriented development. We've already stripped parking pretty low as far as requirements go. I was honored I think I was in the chair when we passed that, actually. But a lot of my colleagues had a lot of questions about, is this really a good thing? Is this what we want? I said, yes, trust me. If they think they need it, they'll build it. Most of them, if you talk to most developers, they don't need it. In neighborhoods like mine and a lot of others.
Because until very recently, the constraint for a lot of housing projects was the amount of parking you had to provide on site, not even the FAR or the dimension of the building piece, correct?
Correct. And that was true of ADUs, right? If I could add one more unit, but I can't add the parking off street, right? We're not going to do a driveway. We're not curb cut or anything like that. So that was a big win. And it happened kind of quietly in one meeting because there was a topic before it that took a lot of the air out of the room. Sometimes that's the best way to pass things. Sometimes it's not, because you want people to be paying attention, right? But how do we continue to use those spaces that are unused for housing is really important. Like I mentioned, we've got way too much commercial space right now in my ward and others, and converting that is really, really important. I'm really encouraged to see a lot of my colleagues actually in lower density areas rezoning to allow for 3 flats.
That's RT4?
Yes. You guys all know the numbers. I can get a little more technical. I usually can't. So, right. So a lot of RT4, which is missing middle, which we've talked about a lot, but we're actually putting some money into, and my colleagues are actually rezoning so that when we're building, and a lot of it is affordable, it's traditional affordable subsidized, that it's not a single family home, but it's a 3 flat. And that's the kind of thing we should be looking at citywide as policy. But then also building off transit nodes in areas that don't have it right now. Government has to prime the pump on that, and we've done it with moderate success in some areas that I won't name, but have seen. And then others where they're just going like gangbusters. So like you go to Hyde Park near the 53rd Street station, I mean, if there's like a new high-rise, right? Not everything has to be a high-rise, but there are opportunities there that we need to be taking advantage of in areas that are a little lower density too. Not that Hyde Park is lower density. So I think there's going to be a lot of things at play. I think, again, reacting to the market is really, really important, and making sure that our policies align.
And outside of zoning itself, with the building code, some of the constraints of just because you're nominally allowed to build a certain number of units on a lot, there may not be a practical way to make that work geometrically.
Right.
What are some of those areas that you think the city, the state could, should, and in some case is looking at?
Sure. I think single stair is something that comes up a lot, and we have an ordinance that's live. There'll probably be a hearing at some point this summer, I would imagine. I'm a co-sponsor of that. It's Alderman Matt Martin's ward. We are in his ward, so I'll give him some deference there. That's probably the biggest thing that's out there, I would say. Look, there's some other code things. Buildings is supposed to be putting something in. I think they may have even last week. I just haven't caught all the way up to streamline. I mean, we've talked about international codes, prefab permits, which actually architects have done forever, but that the city would pre-approve something and then, be able to take this 3-flat, for example, and build it 2,500 times in areas that need them to cut the tape. Whatever we can do to speed up the processes that the city requires is really, really important.
And this is something that smaller cities have done with high level of success. South Bend in Indiana, famously with pre-approved building plans, has a really solid program there that makes it easy for a homeowner to say, I bought this lot, I want to build a home on it, I want to build a duplex on it, I want to build a coach house in the back, to be able to pick from a catalog, get the permits approved and start, as opposed to have someone at City Hall check through all the plans and make sure they meet all the existing conditions.
It's like the new Sears home, right? I mean, they could deliver it, if it's on the lot. And we may be moving to that. And we've talked about 3D printed stuff, which I think there was a bad article about I've read recently. Also, multiple primary buildings on a single lot. There may be ways, especially with affordable or some more modular tiny homes, put 4 tiny homes on a lot as opposed to just one. Things like that have come up. But really kind of speak to areas that are larger scale, that don't have the development right now, where you're dealing with vacant lots or city lots.
Because currently, to your point, you're only allowed to build one primary building on a lot, right?
Right.
Coach house would be an exception to that. But if you wanted to build 2 medium-sized buildings, say, instead of one big one, you're not allowed to do that.
Correct. Or 4 little ones.
Cottage court style.
Right, exactly. And then those could be prefab, like I said, tiny homes, container stuff. Again, when we're looking at affordability, how can we build it as cheaply as possible and as quickly as possible, but still safely, and to meet the building code, but also to revise the building code where it makes sense to just allow more options, allow more things to be built that are considered safe that maybe weren't, or can be made safer than that weren't. A lot of that has to do with exits. Some of it's, distance from exits, right? Windows will probably never go out of style when it comes to bedrooms and light and air, but there's some other things I think that the city will look at. I'm not sure how deep a dive we'll do for the rest of this year. You never know.
And for single stair specifically, Chicago has a very conservative version of that. Most other cities allow 1 exit stairway up to 3 stories. I believe Chicago is the only major metro area in the country that only allows it up to 2 stories, which is even a limitation in some single family homes, let alone
and I think most 2-flats still have the back stair. You see it built that way, especially if they're 2 different units.
Right.
And that is a constraint that we have to work on.
Especially for the middle density apartment buildings, right? You're taking a single or a double lot and you're putting between 8 and 20 units on it, which you can do. And a lot of cities around the world do those kinds of patterns where it's only 4 or 5 stories tall. You have 4 apartments per story. They share a single stairway, fully sprinklered, safer than older buildings that have no sprinklers at all, even if they have 2 exits. But there's a lot of heartburn in some cases when that gets introduced as part of a code that hasn't allowed it for a century.
Absolutely. I mean, that's true of any change to the building code. Let's wait. Let's have a look at this. Let's see how it impacts me, my industry, depending on who you are, labor may think they're going to lose out. Sprinkler fitters think this is a win. Certainly, because we don't have our sprinkler requirements are not very robust compared to a lot of European cities, and other places that have built a lot more new construction. So I think for us, and that may be uphill, right? I mean, for what we're talking about, which is a more conservative, more limited than others. We'll see. It hasn't been socialized through the council as a whole. I think for those of us who work on development, we're familiar. But you never know. There could be some deal out there.
Question I have for you is, what advice would you give to advocates, to people who are enthusiastic, excited about housing, about transit, about walkability, who want to help move the needle on some of these things, but are not themselves builders or developers, or not themselves in city council? How would you encourage them, based on what you've seen helping housing get legalized and pushing it forward in the city, to direct their efforts to be able to make meaningful change?
Sure. I think showing up is, in all the broad sense is what I've seen advocates do. And that's been really, really helpful. I mean, for a long time, you always had someone saying no. And so to have someone always saying yes is great. And there's, that helps bring balance to the conversation. I think, we all are voters in the city, right? We're all residents. We all have elected officials that should be responding to our concerns. I think organizing around specific developments that have big impact citywide is important. I think that working with what Springfield is doing, obviously, I saw Good Lobby Day last week, is really important too. But being local and being involved with your local community group, where a lot of these decisions are made at that level, a lot of aldermen will defer 100% to that group. And when they vote, that's it. You got to be in the room. There's a tendency for those groups to be a little older, a little more homeowner focused, a little bit more long term. But what we're talking about is building our neighborhood for the next 20 years. And so I want as many people, I'm 47, I want as many people who are younger than me as older than me when we're talking about this. And so I've tried to gear my planning and zoning council and some others to try and fit that demographic and hit every corner of the neighborhood too, not just be high-rise dwellers on the East End, which is, is not hard to do. But stay engaged and engaged in those traditional channels is really, really important. Not just, on socials or with organizations that are coming in, but, also looking at maybe some of the partners that we had for ADUs, right? The realtors are very, very pro-housing, right? AARP was a huge piece for us. Access Living, that to continue to be in coalition with those groups when they bring things forward and when the abundance folks bring things forward is really, really important because you see that in all sorts of different movements, right? Equal rights for LGBT folks wouldn't have happened without the support of labor, which was a huge win when it happened 20 years ago, 22 more. So to stay in coalition is really, really key. You're not always going to agree with the realtors on everything, but you're always going to agree that we need more housing. And so stick to that. Yeah.
Yep. Find those areas of similarity.
Absolutely.
And then my last question for you is, what is one thing that you're really proud of or really excited that's coming in the next year that you would like people to know about and you would like to go out there and plug?
We just talked about ADUs for like a half an hour. I mean, that's kind of my thing these days, right? I think we're looking, for me, I have a pretty exciting development at 2800 Sheridan that is really the first large-scale high-rise proposed for Lakeview and 44 in 25 years, probably. Would be the largest number of units on one site since the 90s. And something that we want to take very seriously and carefully to get the design right, to get the access right, to get the first floor right, and work with neighbors to move forward. So I think that's sort of a marquee project, that I'm working on. We'll see legislatively what still happens this term. I think it might be kind of quiet. It might be all budget focused. But for me, it's about promoting ADUs, continuing to see these go from neighborhood to neighborhood. Like I said, I have a number of colleagues that are looking at them now. A few more I'm going to nudge over the summer, I think. And then what other housing policies we can support. I'm working very closely with the governor's policy team to see how I can be helpful there. I'm a native of Rockford, Illinois. The state senator from Peoria officiated my wedding. So I have some downstate cred, and cities that could use a little more development downtown, right? And I've said too, what can I do in a neighborhood that has a lot of investment and is considered to be successful? We have an affordability problem now, but successful overall. But how can I take our success and move it to other parts of the city, and what does that look like, and help them understand what's been workable for me, what we've learned from. And please don't ever try that one thing; it was a bad idea. But still to respect their communities and keep the cultural identity of a lot of communities that I think they're concerned about losing. So, I'm promoting growth. I'm promoting balanced development. I want to grow our tax base. I want more homes for Chicagoans. That's going to look like a few different things for the next year, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Bennett.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.